Chapter 1. The Vela's Warning. Fleur Delacour could have returned to France after the first task. It would have been perfectly reasonable, considering how poorly she had performed against that Hungarian horntail. But something kept pulling her back to thoughts of the dark-haired boy who had faced his dragon with such impossible, reckless courage. The Beauxbatons carriage felt smaller tonight, cramped and suffocating despite its magically expanded interior. Her fellow students had long since retired to their dormitories, leaving Fleur alone with the restless energy that had been building in her chest since she'd watched Harry Potter summon his firebolt and dance through the air like he belonged there. She pressed her palm against the frosted window, watching her breath fog the glass as December wind rattled the carriage's ornate walls. The Vela blood that ran through her veins had always made her sensitive to emotional currents, to the subtle tensions that most people missed entirely. Tonight, that sensitivity felt like a live wire under her skin, sparking and crackling with warnings she couldn't quite interpret. Something was wrong at Hogwarts. Something was wrong with the tournament itself. She closed her eyes and let the feeling wash over her, the way Grandmère had taught her when she was small and the visions first started coming. Most Vela lost the gift of sight after a generation or two of mixing with human blood. But Fleur's grandmother had insisted that dilution didn't always mean diminishment. Sometimes it meant refinement. The vision came slowly at first, like looking through water that gradually cleared. She saw Harry Potter, but not as he had been today in the Great Hall, laughing with his friends over dinner. This Harry was alone, standing in what looked like a vast, cold chamber filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. His green eyes held a weariness that no 14-year-old should possess, and when he turned his head, she could see the weight of invisible chains dragging at his shoulders. But it was the figure standing behind him that made Fleur's breath catch in her throat. Albus Dumbledore's silhouette was unmistakable, even wreathed in that strange, creeping darkness. The old man's hand rested on Harry's shoulder, with what might have looked like paternal affection to anyone else. But Fleur could see the way those fingers pressed down, holding the boy in place. When Dumbledore smiled in the vision, his eyes remained cold and calculating, and Fleur understood with sudden, terrible clarity that Harry Potter was not a champion in this tournament. He was a sacrifice. The vision shattered as someone knocked on the carriage door, and Fleur jerked back to awareness, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, she could hear Madame Maxime's voice calling for evening attendance, but Fleur remained frozen by the window, trying to process what she had seen. The tournament was a trap. She was certain of it now, though the specifics remained frustratingly unclear. Something about the way Harry's name had come out of the goblet, the way the other school's champions had been chosen to ensure they were older, more experienced, more prepared for whatever was truly coming. And Harry, barely 14 and thrust into competition with students who had years more training, was meant to fail. But why? What could Dumbledore possibly gain from the death of the boy who lived? Fleur rose from her seat by the window, pacing the length of the carriage's small sitting area as her mind raced through possibilities. She thought of her little sister Gabrielle back home in France, safe and protected by a family who would move heaven and earth to keep her from harm, and felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Harry Potter had no such protection, despite being perhaps the most famous wizard alive. He lived with muggles who clearly despised him, if the poorly fitting clothes and thin frame were any indication. He had no advocates at Hogwarts, beyond a few teenage friends who couldn't possibly understand the political forces arrayed against him. He had saved her from humiliation during the first task, she realized suddenly. Not intentionally, perhaps, But when he had retrieved the golden egg in record time, despite facing the most dangerous dragon, it had drawn attention away from her own fumbling performance. There had been no mockery in his eyes when they'd passed in the corridors afterward, no gloating or superiority. Just a quiet nod of acknowledgement, as if they were equals rather than competitors. She had dismissed it at the time as typical Gryffindor nobility, but now she wondered if there was something more. Harry Potter treated everyone as equals because he had no real understanding of his own importance, no knowledge of the power he represented, or the wealth he commanded. Someone had kept him ignorant deliberately, and Fleur was beginning to suspect she knew who. The Velar gift was not always reliable, especially when dealing with magic as complex as divination, but the core emotional truth of her visions had never steered her wrong. Harry Potter was in danger from the very people who claimed to protect him, and if she did nothing, that beautiful, fierce courage she'd witnessed during the first task would be extinguished before he ever learned what it truly meant to be free. Fleur made her decision with the same swift certainty that had made her volunteer as Beauxbaton's champion in the first place. She would not let them destroy him. The tournament might be rigged, Dumbledore's intentions might be darker than anyone suspected, but Harry Potter would not face whatever was coming alone. Not if she had anything to say about it. But she would need help. Someone who understood Hogwarts politics better than she did. Someone who could move through the castle without arousing suspicion. Someone who had as much reason as she did to see Harry Potter treated with the dignity and respect he deserved. She thought of the Slytherin girl she'd noticed watching Harry during meals, her expression thoughtful and calculating, in a way that suggested intelligence rather than malice. Daphne Greengrass, if Fleur remembered correctly. Pure blood, but from one of the families rumoured to value honour over politics. Someone who might be willing to listen if approached correctly. It was a risk, certainly. Slytherins were not known for their sentiment, and Daphne Greengrass had no particular reason to trust a Beauxbaton champion she'd never spoken to. But the vision had been clear. Harry needed allies, and Fleur suspected that the girl who watched him with such careful attention might be precisely the ally he needed. Tomorrow, she decided, settling back into her chair with newfound purpose. Tomorrow she would find a way to speak with Daphne Greengrass, and together they would ensure that Harry Potter's courage was rewarded with truth instead of treachery. Outside the carriage windows, snow began to fall more heavily, covering the Hogwarts grounds in pristine white. But Fleur no longer felt the cold. She had work to do. Chapter 2. The Slytherin's Observation. Daphne Greengrass had always been good at watching people when they thought no one was paying attention. It was a skill that served Slytherins well, this ability to observe and catalogue the small tells that revealed so much about a person's true nature. Tonight, curled in one of the leather chairs near the dying fire in the Slytherin common room, she found herself thinking about the particular way Albus Dumbledore looked at Harry Potter. The common room was nearly empty at this late hour, with only a few seventh years hunched over their NEWT preparations at the far tables. The green-tinged light from the lake created shifting patterns on the stone walls, and Daphne let her mind wander back to dinner earlier that evening, when she had watched the headmaster's eyes track Harry's every movement with an intensity that seemed far too calculated for mere grandfatherly concern. There had been a moment, just before dessert appeared, when Harry had laughed at something Ron Weasley said. It was a genuine laugh, bright and unguarded, in a way that transformed his entire face, and Daphne had found herself smiling slightly in response. But when she glanced toward the staff table, she had caught Dumbledore's expression in profile, and the coldness there had made her stomach turn. The old man had been studying Harry like a chess piece whose next move required careful consideration, and there had been something almost predatory in that calculating gaze. It wasn't the first time she had noticed such moments. Over the past 2 months since Harry's name had emerged from the Goblet of Fire, Daphne had become increasingly aware of the way adults at Hogwarts treated the famous boy who lived. They spoke about him constantly, but rarely to him. They made decisions that affected his life without consulting him. Most troubling of all, they seemed to regard his opinions and preferences as entirely irrelevant to whatever grand plans they had laid for his future. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, words spoken during a tense conversation she had overheard last summer between her parents and Lord Greengrass's old friend, Marcus Flint Sr. They had been discussing the war, as they so often did these days, and her father had grown unusually heated when Dumbledore's name arose. "The man believes his own legend too thoroughly," Lord Greengrass had said, his voice carrying the particular edge it took on when he was genuinely angry rather than merely annoyed. This notion of sacrificing individuals for the greater good, it's the same thinking that led to some of our darkest hours. Mark my words, Marcus. Dumbledore's version of victory will cost us more than we can afford to lose. At the time, Daphne had assumed he was speaking in general terms about the war against you-know-who. Now, watching how Dumbledore orchestrated Harry's life from a distance, she wondered if her father's concerns were far more specific than she had realized. The Greengrass family had not always been aligned with the current ministry, nor had they supported you-know-who during his first rise to power. They were what her father called practical traditionalists, believers in pure-blood customs and magical heritage, but equally committed to the idea that power should be earned rather than seized, and that those in authority had obligations to protect those under their care. It was an old-fashioned philosophy, perhaps, but one that had served their family well through several changes of regime, which was why Daphne found Harry Potter's situation so deeply disturbing. She had done her research, naturally. When someone as famous as Harry Potter was thrust into her social sphere, it would have been foolish not to understand the basic facts of his circumstances. What she had discovered had left her increasingly uneasy about the way his life was being managed by those who claimed to have his best interests at heart. Harry Potter was not merely famous, he was wealthy beyond imagination, heir to one of the oldest pure-blood fortunes in Britain, and politically significant enough that his endorsement could shift the balance of power in the Wizengamot. Yet he dressed in clothes that clearly belonged to someone else, seemed to know nothing about his own financial situation, and appeared to have no contact whatsoever with the political and social networks that should have been his birthright. More troubling still was the matter of his living arrangements. The few times Harry had mentioned his relatives, he had done so with a carefully neutral expression that reminded Daphne uncomfortably of the way abused house elves spoke about their masters. She had grown up in a household where children were cherished and protected, where even the most distant relatives would have moved heaven and earth to ensure her safety and happiness. The idea that Harry Potter, was living with muggles who clearly had no affection for him was not merely unusual, it was wrong. And yet everyone seemed to accept it as necessary. Even the professors who clearly cared about Harry's well-being never questioned why the most famous wizard alive was being raised by people who despised everything he represented. They just nodded along with whatever Dumbledore told them, as if the headmaster's word was law rather than opinion. That was what truly worried Daphne. Not that Harry was being mistreated, though that was certainly concerning, but that so many intelligent, capable adults seemed unable or unwilling to question decisions that were clearly harmful to a child in their care. It suggested a level of influence that went beyond normal authority, and in her family's experience, that kind of unquestioned power was almost always dangerous. She thought of her sister Astoria, 2 years younger and currently safe at home for the Christmas holiday. If something ever happened to their parents, Daphne knew beyond any doubt that their extended family would ensure Astoria was loved and protected. The girl would never want for anything, not material comfort, not emotional support, not the knowledge of her own heritage and importance. She would be raised to understand her place in the world and her obligations to others. But she would also be raised to make her own choices about how to fulfill those obligations. Harry Potter had been denied all of that. Someone had made very deliberate decisions to keep him isolated, ignorant, and dependent. And Daphne was beginning to suspect that those decisions had less to do with his safety and more to do with maintaining control over what he might become. The fire in the grate crackled and settled lower, casting new shadows across the common room walls. Daphne rose from her chair and walked to one of the tall windows that looked out over the lake, pressing her palm against the cold glass as she considered what she could do with her growing certainty that something was very wrong at Hogwarts. She could write to her father, of course, but that would likely result in nothing more than a carefully worded letter of concern to the Board of Governors, which would be filed away and forgotten. She could try to approach Harry directly, but they had never spoken beyond the most basic pleasantries, and she doubted he would welcome what might seem like prying from a Slytherin he barely knew. No, what she needed was more information, concrete evidence of the patterns she was only beginning to perceive, and a better understanding of the specific ways Harry's life was being manipulated. Only then could she decide how best to act on her growing conviction that the boy who lived deserved far better than what he was receiving from those who claimed to protect him. The Yule Ball was 5 days away, and with it would come opportunities for observation that the normal school routine did not provide. Perhaps, if she was careful and clever about it, she could find ways to learn more about Harry's true circumstances. And perhaps, if her suspicions proved correct, she could find a way to offer him something that seemed to be in desperately short supply in his life, a real choice about his own future. Daphne made her decision with the same quiet determination that had seen her through 4 years of Slytherin politics. Whatever was happening to Harry Potter, whatever larger game was being played with his life as the stakes, she would not stand by and watch a fellow student be sacrificed for someone else's vision of the greater good. Her family had not survived centuries of political upheaval by ignoring their conscience when it truly mattered. She would not be the first Greengrass to break that tradition. Chapter 3. An Unlikely Alliance. The library was nearly deserted the following evening, with most students either celebrating the approaching Christmas holiday or cramming for end-of-term examinations. Daphne had chosen a table in the farthest corner of the charms section, surrounded by dusty tomes on advanced magical theory that would deter all but the most dedicated scholars. She had been there for over an hour, ostensibly researching for Professor Flitwick's essay on the ethical implications of memory charms, but in reality, using the quiet space to think through everything she had observed about Harry Potter's situation. The soft sound of footsteps on the ancient carpet made her look up, expecting to see Madame Pince on one of her rounds. Instead, she found herself facing Fleur Delacour, who approached with the careful grace that seemed to come naturally to someone with Vila heritage. "Pardon-moi," Fleur said softly, her accent lending a musical quality to the words. "Might I join you? The other tables, they are either too crowded or too close to the librarian's desk." Daphne studied the Beauxbatons champion with carefully neutral eyes, noting the slight tension in her posture that suggested this encounter was not as casual as it appeared. "Of course," she replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Though I should warn you, I'm working on rather dry material. Magical ethics isn't particularly riveting reading." Fleur settled into the offered seat with fluid elegance, but Daphne caught the way her gaze swept the area to ensure they were truly alone. "Perhaps that depends on the specific ethical questions being considered," she said carefully. Some moral dilemmas are far more immediate than others. There was something in her tone that made Daphne set down her quill and give the other girl her full attention. You sound as though you have a particular dilemma in mind. Perhaps I do. Fleur's blue eyes met Daphne's grey ones directly, and there was a weight in that gaze that seemed far older than her 17 years. Tell me, what do you think of the way adults make decisions for children at this school? It was not the question Daphne had been expecting, but it struck uncomfortably close to her own recent thoughts. That's rather a broad topic, she said slowly, testing the waters. Are you referring to anything specific? Fleur leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even further. I am referring to the way certain adults make decisions about certain children's futures without consulting the children themselves, even when those decisions might put the children in danger. Daphne felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression carefully composed. This was either a remarkable coincidence or something far more deliberate. And why would you think I might have opinions on such a subject? Because, Fleur said simply, I have watched you watching. You notice things, I think. Things that others miss or choose to ignore. There was a long moment of silence as Daphne weighed her options. This could be a trap of some kind, though she couldn't imagine what purpose it would serve. More likely, it was exactly what it appeared to be. Another student who had noticed the same troubling patterns she had observed. Hypothetically, she said finally, what sort of decisions are we discussing? Fleur's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if Daphne's willingness to engage was some kind of relief. The decision to place a famous child with relatives who despise him. The decision to keep that child ignorant of his own heritage and importance. The decision to allow that child to be entered into a deadly competition without proper preparation or support. Those would indeed be concerning decisions, Daphne agreed carefully. Hypothetically speaking. And if someone had insights into why such decisions might be made, and those insights suggested the child was in far more danger than anyone realized, what do you think should be done? Daphne set down her book entirely, abandoning any pretense of studying. What sort of insights? Fleur hesitated for a moment, and Daphne could see her weighing how much to reveal. Have you ever heard of Velar sight? She asked finally. The ability some of us have to sense emotional currents and potential futures. I've read about it, Daphne said slowly, though I understood it was quite rare, even among those with Velar heritage. It is, and it is not always reliable, more like intuition than true prophecy. But sometimes, when the emotions involved are particularly strong, the visions can be quite clear. Fleur's hands tightened slightly around the edge of the table. 2 nights ago, I had such a vision about Harry Potter. Daphne leaned forward, genuinely intrigued now. What did you see? Darkness, Fleur said simply. He was surrounded by shadows that moved with their own purpose, wearing chains I could not see, but somehow knew were there. And behind him, she paused, seeming to gather her courage. Behind him stood Albus Dumbledore, but not as the kindly grandfather everyone believes him to be. In the vision, he was the one holding Harry in place, ensuring he could not escape whatever fate had been planned for him. The words sent a chill down Daphne's spine, not because they seemed impossible, but because they aligned so perfectly with her own growing suspicions. That's a very serious accusation to make based on a vision, she said carefully. It is, Fleur agreed, which is why I need someone who understands this castle and its politics better than I do. Someone who can tell me whether what I saw aligns with what can be observed through more conventional means. Daphne was quiet for a long moment, considering both the risk and the opportunity this conversation represented. Finally, she made her decision. My family has certain principles, she said slowly. We believe that those in power have obligations to protect those under their care. We also believe that children should be raised to understand their heritage and make their own choices about how to honor it. And Harry Potter has been denied both protection and choice, Fleur said, nodding. Yes. He lives with relatives who clearly mistreat him. He knows nothing about his own wealth or political importance. He seems to have no real advocates beyond a few teenagers who can't possibly understand the forces arrayed against him. Daphne's voice grew firmer as she spoke. And most troubling of all, every adult who should be protecting his interests instead defers to Dumbledore's judgment, even when that judgment appears to be harmful. Then you have seen it too, Fleur said, with evident relief. The way he is being managed rather than protected. I have. The question is what can be done about it. Daphne studied Fleur's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. What exactly are you proposing? I propose that we find a way to give Harry Potter what he has been denied. Truth, choice, and genuine protection. Fleur's accent grew stronger as her emotions intensified. He deserves to know who he really is, what resources are available to him, and what options he has beyond the path that has been chosen for him. That would be complicated, Daphne said slowly, and potentially dangerous. If Dumbledore truly is manipulating Harry's circumstances for some larger purpose, he won't simply allow that manipulation to be exposed. No, he will not, which is why we must be clever about it. Fleur leaned forward, conspiratorially. You understand the political landscape here in ways I cannot. I have insights that might reveal dangers others cannot see. Together, we might be able to protect him in ways that neither of us could manage alone. Daphne found herself nodding slowly. It was a risk, certainly, but the alternative was to continue watching while a fellow student was slowly destroyed by forces he didn't even know existed. What did you have in mind? First, we gather more information, confirm what my vision suggested, and learn the specifics of how his life is being controlled. Then, we find a way to approach him directly, carefully, so as not to arouse suspicion from those who monitor his interactions. The Yule Ball, Daphne said suddenly. It would provide opportunities for observation and conversation that normal school routine doesn't allow. Exactamente. And if we are careful about it, we might be able to begin showing him truths about his situation without making it obvious what we are doing. Fleur's smile was sharp with determination. Will you help me, Daphne Greengrass? Will you help me give Harry Potter the chance to choose his own future? Daphne thought of her sister Astoria, safe at home, and surrounded by family who would never dream of sacrificing her for any cause, no matter how noble. She thought of her father's words about the dangers of unquestioned authority and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. Yes, she said firmly. But we do this properly. No half measures, no impulsive actions that could make things worse for him. We gather evidence, we plan carefully, and we make sure that whatever we reveal to him comes with real solutions, not just problems. Fleur extended her hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Daphne took it. Partners? The French girl asked. Partners, Daphne confirmed, and felt the weight of a decision that would change everything. They spent the next hour in quiet conversation, sharing observations and beginning to sketch the outline of a plan that would require all of Fleur's magical insight and all of Daphne's political knowledge. By the time they parted ways, both girls carried the seeds of something that would either save Harry Potter or destroy them all. Chapter 4. Gathering Intelligence. The next 24 hours passed in a careful dance of observation and discreet inquiry. Daphne and Fleur had agreed to work separately during the day to avoid drawing attention to their newfound alliance, meeting only briefly in the library each evening to share what they had learned. What they discovered was far more disturbing than either had anticipated. Daphne began with what she knew best, the intricate web of pure blood family connections that governed so much of wizarding society. The Slytherin Common Room was particularly well suited for such research, as it contained students from nearly every significant magical family in Britain. A carefully worded question here, a casual observation there, and the picture that emerged was deeply troubling. "My father mentioned something odd last summer," Pansy Parkinson had said when Daphne brought up the subject of Harry Potter's guardianship during their ancient runes study session. Apparently, several families offered to take Potter in after his parents were killed. The Longbottoms, the Bones family, even some of the foreign magical communities. But Dumbledore insisted he belonged with his mother's relatives. "Muggles," Tracy Davis had added, with obvious distaste. "My mother couldn't understand why anyone would place the most famous wizard child alive with people who hate magic. She said it went against every tradition of proper guardianship." The more Daphne probed, the clearer the pattern became. Harry Potter had not been placed with the Dursleys because they were his only option, or even his best option. He had been placed with them despite numerous better alternatives, and that placement had been enforced by Albus Dumbledore against the wishes of families who would have been honoured to raise him properly. Meanwhile, Fleur focused her attention on observing Dumbledore's direct interactions with Harry. What she saw confirmed her worst suspicions about the headmaster's methods. During breakfast on Tuesday morning, she watched as Harry approached the staff table to ask a question about the second task. Dumbledore's response was masterful in its manipulation, grandfatherly concern mixed with just enough vague reassurance to prevent Harry from pressing for specifics, combined with a subtle redirection that left the boy feeling foolish for having asked. "Trust in your friends, Harry," the headmaster had said, with his characteristic twinkling smile. "And remember that sometimes the greatest courage lies in accepting that we cannot understand everything at once." It sounded wise and comforting, but Fleur recognized it for what it truly was, a way of discouraging Harry from seeking the information he needed to protect himself. The boy had left the conversation looking frustrated and confused, no closer to understanding what he would face in the coming task. That afternoon, Fleur witnessed an even more troubling exchange. Harry had received an owl during lunch, a rare occurrence that immediately caught her attention. She watched as he opened what appeared to be an official-looking letter, his face lighting up with surprise and pleasure. But before he could share the contents with his friends, Professor McGonagall appeared at his shoulder. "Mr. Potter, the headmaster would like to see you in his office immediately," she had said, her voice carrying an urgency that seemed disproportionate to whatever the letter contained. Harry had folded the letter hastily and followed McGonagall from the great hall, but not before Fleur caught a glimpse of official letterhead that bore the distinctive seal of Gringotts Wizarding Bank. When Harry returned to the common room that evening, he seemed subdued and distracted, and the letter was nowhere to be seen. "It was probably just routine business," Ron had said dismissively, when Harry mentioned the summons to his friends. "You know how Dumbledore is about security and stuff." But Fleur knew better. She had grown up in the French magical community, where Gringotts communications were regarded as sacred matters of financial privacy. The idea that a headmaster would confiscate a student's banking correspondence was not merely unusual. It was a serious breach of wizarding law. When she and Daphne met in the library that evening, the weight of their discoveries hung heavy between them. "It's worse than I thought," Daphne said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I've spoken with students from 7 different pure-blood families, and the story is always the same. Their parents remember multiple offers to take Harry in, all of them declined by Dumbledore. Some of the families were quite insistent, apparently. The Bones family in particular. Susan's aunt is head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and she felt strongly that Harry should be raised within the magical community. But Dumbledore refused all of them," Fleur said grimly. "Yes, and when pressed for his reasoning, he always cited security concerns and blood protections that required Harry to remain with his relatives." Daphne's expression darkened. "But here's what's truly disturbing. Several of these families have remained interested in Harry's welfare over the years. They've sent letters, invitations to family gatherings, offers of mentorship and guidance. None of those letters ever reached him. Fleur felt her stomach tighten. "How do you know?" "Because I asked. Carefully, of course, and only of people I trust to be discreet. But the pattern is unmistakable. The Bones family alone has sent nearly 20 invitations over the past 4 years. The Longbottoms have written regularly, offering to share memories of his parents and help him understand his family's history. There have been offers from foreign families as well. My own parents among them, actually. Beauxbaton has a traditional relationship with the Potter family going back centuries. And none of these reached Harry. None. Which means someone has been intercepting his mail systematically." Daphne's voice carried a cold fury that reminded Fleur she was speaking to someone whose family had navigated political intrigue for generations. "That's not just manipulation, it's imprisonment. Harry Potter has been deliberately isolated from everyone who might help him understand his true position in our world." Fleur shared what she had observed about Dumbledore's direct interactions with Harry, including the incident with the Gringotts letter. Daphne listened with growing alarm. "A banking letter," she repeated slowly. "And Dumbledore confiscated it immediately?" "Within minutes of Harry receiving it. And when Harry returned from the headmaster's office, he seemed diminished, as if he had been made to feel foolish for his interest in whatever the letter contained." "This is unconscionable," Daphne said flatly. "In the pure-blood community, a person's relationship with Gringotts is considered absolutely sacred. For someone to interfere with that relationship without the account holder's consent—" She paused, seemingly struck by a new thought. "Fleur, do you think Harry even knows about his inheritance?" "What do you mean?" "I mean the full extent of it. Everyone knows he's wealthy, of course. The Potter family fortune is legendary. But there's more than just money involved. The Potters held seats on the Wizengamot, they had political alliances and trade relationships throughout the magical world. They owned properties and businesses that should be generating income and influence." Daphne's eyes were bright with a terrible understanding. If Harry doesn't know about any of that, if he's been kept ignorant of his own resources, then he's been made helpless when he should be one of the most powerful people in Britain, Fleur finished softly. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the implications of what they had discovered. Harry Potter was not merely being protected through questionable means, he was being systematically disempowered, cut off from every resource and relationship that might allow him to make independent choices about his own life. "We have to tell him," Fleur said finally. "However dangerous it might be, he deserves to know the truth." "Yes," Daphne agreed, "but not yet. If we approach him now, with nothing but accusations and suspicions, Dumbledore will simply discredit us and tighten his control even further. We need evidence, and we need a plan for what Harry can do with the information once he has it." "The Yule Ball," Fleur said thoughtfully. "It will provide opportunities for private conversation. And with all the international visitors present, it might be harder for Dumbledore to monitor every interaction." "Exactly. And in the meantime, we keep gathering information. I want to know everything about Harry's financial situation, his political rights, and the legal mechanisms that are being used to control him. If we're going to free him from this web of manipulation, we need to understand exactly how it was constructed." Fleur nodded, feeling the weight of their task settling on her shoulders. They were planning to challenge one of the most powerful wizards alive, and they were doing it to protect someone who didn't even know he needed protection. But as she thought of Harry's genuine smile when he laughed with his friends, and the way his eyes held both courage and loneliness in equal measure, she knew they had no choice. Someone had to give Harry Potter what he had been denied for far too long, the truth about who he was, and the chance to choose who he might become. The Yule Ball was 3 days away. They had that long to prepare for what might be the most important conversation of Harry Potter's life. Chapter 5. The Yule Ball Preparation. 2 days before the Yule Ball, Fleur Delacour found Roger Davies in the courtyard near the Ravenclaw Tower, practicing dance steps with obvious nervousness. She approached him with the graceful confidence that had made her Beauxbatons champion, though her heart was racing with the magnitude of what she was about to set in motion. "Roger," she said softly, and watched him nearly stumble over his own feet as he turned to face her. "Might I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course," he replied, his voice cracking slightly in the way that always happened when he was near her. "Is everything all right? You're not having second thoughts about the ball, are you?" Fleur felt a pang of genuine regret at what she was about to do. Roger was a pleasant boy, and he had been nothing but kind to her since agreeing to be her partner. But Harry Potter's freedom was worth more than one evening's social discomfort. "I am afraid there has been a complication," she said carefully. "I have received word from Madame Maxime that there are certain diplomatic expectations regarding my choice of partner for the ball. As a champion representing Beauxbatons, it seems I am expected to attend with someone who can help strengthen international magical relations." Roger's face fell, but he nodded with the resigned understanding of someone who had never quite believed his luck would last. "I see. Is there someone specific you're supposed to go with?" "Actually, yes." Fleur took a breath, preparing to lie with the conviction that the truth was too complex to explain. The French ministry has expressed interest in building stronger ties with certain prominent British wizarding families. I have been encouraged to use this opportunity to begin such connections. "Right," Roger said, though his disappointment was obvious. "Well, I suppose I understand. Politics and all that." Fleur placed a gentle hand on his arm, genuinely sorry for the deception. "You are very gracious, Roger. Perhaps we might save a dance during the evening? I would hate for this diplomatic nonsense to ruin our friendship entirely." His smile returned, small but genuine. "I'd like that. And hey, at least now I have a good excuse for why I'm going stag to the most important ball in Hogwarts history." Meanwhile, in the Slytherin common room, Daphne was preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her academic career. She had spent the morning observing Harry's increasingly desperate attempts to find a partner for the ball, watching with a mixture of sympathy and strategic calculation as he fumbled through awkward conversations with various Gryffindor girls. The problem, she realized, was that Harry Potter had absolutely no understanding of his own appeal. He approached each potential partner as if he were asking an enormous favor, rather than offering the social opportunity of a lifetime. It was simultaneously endearing and heartbreaking, this complete lack of awareness of his own worth. She found him that afternoon in the library, slumped over a potions textbook with the defeated posture of someone who had run out of options. The sight of him sitting alone, looking so young and lost despite everything he had already endured, strengthened her resolve. "Harry," she said quietly, settling into the chair across from him without invitation. "Might I have a word?" He looked up, startled, and she saw the moment of confusion that crossed his face at finding a Slytherin student addressing him by his first name. Sure, I suppose. Is everything all right?" "That depends," she said, allowing a small smile to play at the corners of her mouth. "I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be having some difficulty finding a partner for the Yule Ball." Harry's cheeks reddened, and he looked away uncomfortably. "It's not a big deal. I mean, it is a big deal, but not. I'll figure something out." "Actually," Daphne said, her voice carefully casual, "I was wondering if you might consider attending with me." The silence that followed was so complete that Daphne could hear the scratching of quills from tables several rows away. Harry stared at her, as if she had just suggested they travel to the moon together. Are you serious?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Quite serious. I realize it might seem unusual, given our different houses, But I think we might find we have more in common than appearances would suggest." She leaned forward slightly, letting genuine warmth enter her voice. "Besides, I suspect we're both tired of the artificial divisions that seem to govern so much of school politics." Harry blinked several times, as if trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of the world. "But why me? I mean, you could probably go with anyone you wanted. Someone from your own house, or one of the older students, or... Because you're the only person in this castle who has ever shown real courage when it mattered," Daphne said simply, and watched his eyes widen with surprise. "Because you faced a dragon with nothing but your wand and your firebolt, and you did it without expecting any reward beyond surviving. Because..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because I think there are things about this place, and about the wizarding world in general, that you should know. Things that might be easier to discuss away from the usual social pressures." "I don't understand," Harry said slowly, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wanted to. "You don't have to understand everything right now," Daphne replied, echoing the words she had heard Dumbledore use to dismiss Harry's questions, but investing them with entirely different meaning. "Sometimes the most important conversations happen when we least expect them. Will you trust me enough to find out what I mean?" Harry studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing possibilities he had never considered before. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right. Yes, I'd be honored to attend the ball with you, Daphne." The way he said her name, with careful pronunciation and genuine respect, made something warm unfurl in her chest. "Thank you, Harry. I think you might be surprised by how much we have to discuss." Over the next day and a half, both Fleur and Daphne began the delicate work of building Harry's confidence and trust. Fleur arranged a series of seemingly accidental encounters in the corridors between classes, near the Great Hall before meals, in the library where Harry often studied alone. Each interaction was brief but meaningful, designed to show Harry that someone valued his thoughts and opinions. "I wanted to thank you," she said during one such encounter, appearing at his elbow as he waited for Professor McGonagall to unlock the Transfiguration classroom. "For your conduct during the first task. It showed great character, the way you handled yourself under pressure." Harry looked genuinely baffled. "I don't know what you mean. I just did what I had to do." "Exactly," Fleur said, smiling at his confusion. Many people would have complained about the unfairness of the situation or demanded special considerations because of their age. You simply rose to meet the challenge. That speaks to something important about who you are as a person." "Most people think I'm just trouble," Harry muttered, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Most people," Fleur said gently, "have never bothered to look past the surface. I suspect there is much more to Harry Potter than even Harry Potter realizes." Meanwhile, Daphne used their growing friendship to plant subtle seeds of curiosity about his place in wizarding society. During their study sessions in the library, she would make casual observations about magical families and their histories, watching Harry's face for signs of interest or confusion. "It's fascinating how different families maintain their influence across generations," she said one evening, ostensibly discussing their history of magic assignment. "The Longbottoms, for instance, they've held the same seats on the Wizengamot for over 2 centuries. Traditional families like that often have very specific ideas about honor and duty." "The Wizengamot," Harry repeated slowly. "That's like the magical government, right?" "More like the magical court and parliament combined," Daphne explained, noting his obvious lack of knowledge with careful neutrality. "Old families often have hereditary seats that pass down through the bloodlines. It's one of the ways that magical society maintains continuity across generations." "Must be nice," Harry said with a trace of wistfulness, "having that kind of connection to something larger than yourself." "Yes," Daphne agreed quietly. "It must be." By the evening before the ball, both girls were confident that they had laid the necessary groundwork for what was to come. Harry seemed more relaxed around them, more willing to engage in conversation and consider perspectives beyond his usual experience. Most importantly, he had begun to trust them. Tentatively, perhaps, but genuinely. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" Fleur asked Daphne during their final planning session in the library. "As ready as one can be for something like this," Daphne replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she closed her Ancient Runes textbook. "You realize there will be no going back once we tell him everything." "No," Fleur agreed. "But there is no going back anyway. My vision has not changed. If anything, it has grown stronger. Harry is in danger, and that danger will only increase if he remains ignorant of his true situation." "Tomorrow, then," Daphne said, rising from her chair with the decisive grace of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "Tomorrow we give Harry Potter what he has been denied for far too long. The truth about who he really is, and the chance to choose what he wants to become." As they parted ways for the evening, both girls carried the weight of what they were about to attempt. In less than 24 hours, they would either free Harry Potter from the web of manipulation that had defined his life, or they would all face consequences that neither could fully predict. But watching Harry smile with genuine happiness when Daphne had agreed to attend the ball with him, seeing the way his entire posture had changed when someone finally treated him as worthy of respect and consideration, they knew they had made the right choice. Harry Potter deserved to know the truth, and tomorrow, no matter what the cost, they would ensure that he finally received it. Chapter 6. The Yule Ball Revelations. The great hall had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Frost-covered trees lined the walls, their branches sparkling with enchanted snow that never melted, and hundreds of floating candles cast a warm, golden glow over the assembled guests. The 4 house tables had been replaced with smaller, more intimate arrangements, creating pockets of conversation and laughter throughout the space. Harry Potter had never felt more out of place in his life, and yet somehow, for the first time in memory, that didn't seem to matter. "You look quite handsome," Daphne said softly as they entered the hall together, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore midnight blue dress robes that complemented her pale hair perfectly, and when she smiled at him, Harry felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in his chest. "Thanks," he managed, still somewhat stunned that this was actually happening. "You look... you're beautiful." Daphne's smile widened, and Harry realized with surprise that she seemed genuinely pleased by his fumbling compliment rather than amused or condescending. It was such a novel experience that he found himself standing a little straighter as they made their way to one of the smaller tables near the center of the hall. "Harry!" Fleur's voice carried a musical quality that seemed to harmonize with the enchanted atmosphere. She approached their table with fluid grace, her silver dress robes catching the candlelight in ways that made her seem almost ethereal. "You look quite dashing this evening. Daphne, you have excellent taste." As the evening progressed, Harry found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't thought possible. For once, he wasn't being stared at as the famous boy who lived or pitted as the orphan who lived with horrible relatives. Fleur and Daphne treated him simply as Harry, someone worthy of their time and attention, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. They danced, awkwardly at first, but with growing confidence as the evening wore on. They shared stories about their different schools and traditions, laughed at Fleur's tales of beaux bâtons, more dramatic students, and discussed books they had all read with the enthusiasm of people discovering unexpected common ground. "I never realized how much I missed this," Harry said during a brief pause between songs, gesturing toward the magical decorations and the general atmosphere of celebration. "Missed what?" Daphne asked gently. "Feeling normal, I suppose. Like I belong somewhere." Harry's voice carried a wistfulness that made both girls exchange a meaningful look. I know I don't really belong here, with all this formal stuff and political families and everything. But tonight it almost feels like I could." What makes you think you don't belong here? Fleur asked carefully, setting down her goblet of pumpkin juice. You are as much a part of the wizarding world as anyone in this room. Harry laughed, but there was no humor in it. Come on, look around at everyone else here tonight. They all know how to do this. The dancing, the formal conversations, the way you're supposed to act at events like this. I learned to waltz from a book I borrowed from the library 3 days ago. And yet you dance quite well, Daphne observed, her voice carrying a note of something Harry couldn't quite identify. Harry, may I ask you something? What do you know about your family's place in wizarding society? Not much, I suppose. I know my parents were popular, and they fought against Voldemort, and... Harry paused, looking confused. Why do you ask? Daphne leaned forward slightly, her grey eyes serious. The Potter family is one of the oldest magical bloodlines in Britain. They've held seats on the Wizengamot, that's our magical government, for over 4 centuries. Your great-grandfather was instrumental in establishing many of the international magical cooperation agreements that still govern how different countries' magical communities interact. Harry stared at her, as if she were speaking a foreign language. That can't be right. I mean, I would know about that, wouldn't I? Would you? Fleur asked softly. Tell me, Harry, who taught you about your family's history? Who explained your inheritance to you, or your rights and responsibilities as a member of one of the most prominent magical families in the world? The silence that followed was deafening. Harry's face had gone very pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his goblet. No one, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. No one's ever told me any of that. Harry, Daphne said gently, when was the last time you visited Gringotts? When did you last speak with your account manager about your inheritance? I've only been to Gringotts once, when Hagrid took me before first year. He said I had enough money for school, and that was... Harry trailed off, his brow furrowing. That was all I needed to know, I suppose. Fleur and Daphne exchanged another look, and Harry caught it this time. What? He demanded, his voice taking on an edge of alarm. What aren't you telling me? Harry, Fleur said carefully, the Potter family fortune is legendary throughout the magical world. Your vault at Gringotts isn't just sufficient for school expenses. It's one of the largest private holdings in Britain. Beyond that, your family owns properties, businesses, and has political alliances that span the globe. That's impossible, Harry said flatly. If that were true, someone would have told me. The Dursleys would have. Or Dumbledore would have. He stopped, his eyes widening as a terrible possibility occurred to him. Harry, Daphne said quietly, when did you last receive post that wasn't school-related? Letters from family friends, invitations to social events, correspondence from Gringotts about your accounts. I don't get letters like that, Harry said slowly. I mean, why would I? I don't have family friends, and no one would want to invite me to anything important. But that's not true, Fleur said urgently. Harry, dozens of families have written to you over the years. The Longbottoms, the Bones family, international magical families who knew your parents. They've all sent letters, invitations, offers of friendship and mentorship. Harry's face was now completely white. No, they haven't. I would remember getting letters like that. Because you never received them, Daphne said, her voice carrying a cold fury that Harry had never heard from her before. Someone has been intercepting your mail, controlling what information reaches you, keeping you isolated from everyone who might help you understand your true position in our world. The Great Hall suddenly felt too hot, too bright, too full of laughing people who seemed to exist in a completely different reality than the one Harry was discovering. He pushed back from the table abruptly, his breathing shallow and rapid. This can't be true, he said. But even as he spoke, pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The way adults always spoke about him, rather than to him. The way his questions about his family or his future were always deflected, or dismissed. The way he had been kept ignorant of basic facts about wizarding society that every other magical child learned as a matter of course. "Harry," Fleur said gently, rising from her seat to place a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I know this is overwhelming, but you deserve to know the truth." "Who?" Harry asked, his voice raw with a combination of betrayal and growing anger. "Who would do this to me?" Daphne and Fleur exchanged one final look before Daphne answered, her voice heavy with regret. "Albus Dumbledore." The name hit Harry like a physical blow. He looked around wildly, as if expecting the headmaster to materialize at the mention of his name, and indeed, when his gaze swept across the staff table, he found Dumbledore watching him with those piercing blue eyes that suddenly seemed far less kind than they once had. "But why?" Harry whispered. "Why would he want to keep me ignorant? What could he possibly gain from it?" "We don't know all the reasons," Daphne admitted, "but keeping you isolated, keeping you dependent on his guidance and protection, it ensures that you never develop the independence or resources to make your own choices about your future." Harry sank back into his chair, his mind reeling as years of his life suddenly took on a completely different meaning. Every time Dumbledore had deflected his questions with gentle wisdom about patience and trust. Every time his letters had been mysteriously light despite his fame. Every decision that had been made about his life without consulting him. "I've been a prisoner," he said slowly, the full horror of it settling over him. "Not in a cell, but a prisoner all the same." "Yes," Fleur said quietly, "but you don't have to remain one." Harry looked up at her, then at Daphne, and saw something in their faces that he had rarely experienced in his life. Absolute, unwavering support. "What can I do?" he asked. "I'm still underage, still stuck at Hogwarts, still dependent on adults who apparently can't be trusted. Even if everything you're telling me is true, what options do I really have?" "More than you think," Daphne said firmly. "The wizarding world has laws about inheritance and emancipation. As the heir to an ancient house, you have rights that cannot be taken away, even by someone as powerful as Dumbledore. It will require careful planning and the right allies. But you can reclaim your autonomy." "And you won't be doing it alone," Fleur added, her voice carrying an intensity that made her Veela heritage suddenly visible in the way her eyes seemed to glow. "We will help you. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, you will not face this alone." Harry felt something shift inside him, something that had been small and afraid and constantly apologetic, suddenly straightening its spine and lifting its head. For the first time in his life, he understood that he had choices beyond accepting whatever adults decided was best for him. "Where do we start?" he asked, and both girls smiled at the steel that had entered his voice. "With truth," Daphne said. "With learning everything you should have been taught years ago, and with ensuring that no one ever again makes decisions about your life without your knowledge and consent." Across the Great Hall, Albus Dumbledore continued to watch the three young people with growing unease. Something had changed in Harry Potter tonight, something fundamental and irreversible. The boy's posture was different, his expression more alert and determined than Dumbledore had ever seen it. The headmaster made a mental note to schedule a conversation with Harry very soon. Some situations, he reflected, required more direct intervention than others, but for now, Harry Potter was no longer looking in his direction. The boy was leaning forward, listening intently as his two companions began to sketch out a future that would be entirely his own choosing. The game, Dumbledore realized, with the first stirring of genuine alarm he had felt in many years, had fundamentally changed. Chapter 7. The Headmaster's Suspicion. The morning after the Yule ball found Harry Potter sitting in the Gryffindor common room with a cup of tea and a copy of Magical Inheritance Law that Daphne had discreetly lent him. The book made for fascinating, if infuriating, reading. Every page revealed another right he possessed that he had never known existed, another protection that should have been explained to him years ago. "Blimey, Harry, you're up early," Ron said as he stumbled down from the dormitory, his hair sticking up at odd angles. "And what's that you're reading? Looks dead boring." "Just some light reading," Harry replied, carefully closing the book and setting it aside. The irony of calling inheritance law light reading wasn't lost on him, but he wasn't ready to explain his new discoveries to Ron. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The change in Harry's perspective was subtle but profound. Where once he might have immediately shared his concerns with his best friend, he now found himself considering the political implications of every conversation. Ron meant well, but his family's loyalty to Dumbledore was absolute, and Harry could no longer afford to trust anyone whose primary allegiance lay elsewhere. When the summons came, Harry wasn't surprised. "Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said, appearing at his elbow as he finished his breakfast in the Great Hall. "The headmaster would like to see you in his office, immediately, if you please." Harry nodded calmly, noting the slight tightening around McGonagall's eyes that suggested this wasn't a routine request. As he followed her through the corridors toward Dumbledore's office, he felt a strange combination of nervousness and anticipation. For the first time in his life, he would be entering that circular office as someone who knew exactly what game was being played. "Ah, Harry," Dumbledore said, as Harry settled into the chair across from his desk. The headmaster's blue eyes twinkled with their usual warmth, but Harry could now see the calculating assessment behind that grandfatherly facade. "I trust you enjoyed the Yule ball? You seemed quite engaged with your companions for the evening." "I did enjoy it, sir," Harry replied carefully. "It was educational." Something flickered across Dumbledore's expression, too quick for most people to catch, but Harry was watching for it now. "Educational? In what sense?" "I learned quite a bit about wizarding society that I hadn't known before," Harry said, keeping his voice neutral and respectful. "About family histories, traditions, that sort of thing." "Indeed." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture Harry had always found comforting. Now it struck him as vaguely threatening. "And tell me, Harry, what prompted this sudden interest in such matters? They are rather advanced topics for someone your age." Harry felt a flash of the old uncertainty, the familiar impulse to apologize for having thoughts and interests that apparently exceeded his station. But then he remembered Daphne's words about his rights as the heir to an ancient house, and Fleur's gentle insistence that his opinions mattered. "With respect, sir, I'm not sure my age is relevant," he said quietly. "These are matters that concern my own family and heritage. Surely I have a right to learn about them when the opportunity arises." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Dumbledore's eyes no longer twinkled. Instead, they studied Harry with the intensity of someone reassessing a situation that had taken an unexpected turn. "Of course you have such a right, my dear boy," Dumbledore said, finally, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "However, I fear that incomplete information about such complex matters might lead to misunderstandings about your current situation." "What sort of misunderstandings?" Harry asked, and was pleased to note that his voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "Well, for instance, you might begin to question decisions that were made in your best interests by people who understand the larger picture better than—" Dumbledore paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Better than someone who has not yet had the benefit of years of experience in such matters." Harry felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the same feeling he always got when adults reminded him how young and ignorant he was, how much he didn't understand about the world around him. But this time, instead of accepting that weight, he examined it. "Professor," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that I shouldn't try to understand my own inheritance and family history because I might disagree with decisions that other people have made about my life?" "Not at all, Harry. I'm simply suggesting that some conversations are best had when you have a fuller understanding of the complexities involved." Dumbledore's voice carried a note of gentle reproof. "There are aspects of your situation that require careful consideration of factors beyond immediate family concerns." "Such as?" The question hung in the air between them. Harry had never challenged Dumbledore so directly before, never pressed for specific answers when offered vague generalities. He could see the moment when the headmaster realized that his usual tactics weren't working as they once had. "Your safety, for one thing," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "The wizarding world can be a dangerous place for someone of your prominence, particularly when that person lacks the experience to navigate its political currents wisely." "I see." Harry considered this for a moment. "And who, exactly, has been ensuring my safety all these years?" "I have, my boy, along with others who care deeply about your welfare. By placing me with relatives who despise everything I represent, by ensuring I knew nothing about my own heritage or resources." Harry's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it that made Dumbledore's eyes narrow slightly. "Forgive me, Professor, but that seems like a rather unusual definition of safety." "Harry," Dumbledore said, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of genuine warning. "I understand that you may be feeling confused or even angry about certain aspects of your upbringing. Such feelings are natural for someone your age. But I hope you will not allow temporary emotions to cloud your judgment about matters that are far more complex than they appear." "I'm not confused, sir," Harry replied quietly. "If anything, I'm seeing clearly for the first time in my life." Dumbledore leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed intently on Harry's face. "And what, precisely, do you think you're seeing?" Harry met that stare steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage he possessed. "I think I'm seeing that my ignorance about my own situation has been deliberately maintained. I think I'm seeing that decisions have been made about my life without my knowledge or consent. And I think I'm seeing that the people who claim to have my best interests at heart have been far more concerned with controlling my choices than with preparing me to make informed decisions for myself." The silence that followed was absolute. Dumbledore's face had gone very still, and Harry could practically see the wheels turning behind those famous blue eyes as the headmaster reassessed everything he thought he knew about the conversation they were having. "That is a very serious accusation, Harry," Dumbledore said, finally, his voice carefully neutral. "One that suggests you have been discussing your situation with people who may not have your best interests at heart." "On the contrary, sir," Harry replied, feeling a surge of protective anger on behalf of his new allies. "I've been discussing my situation with people who believe I have a right to know the truth about my own life." "And who, might I ask, are these people?" Harry smiled slightly, recognizing the question for what it was, an attempt to identify and neutralize the sources of his newfound independence. People who understand that knowledge and choice are not dangerous concepts, even for someone my age. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently against his desk. When he spoke again, his voice carried a hardness that Harry had never heard before. "Harry, I hope you will remember that there are forces in this world that would be very happy to manipulate a young man of your importance for their own ends. Not everyone who offers you information or friendship has pure motives." "I understand that, sir," Harry said, rising from his chair with a dignity that seemed to surprise even himself. "That's precisely why I've decided to start thinking for myself." As Harry reached the door, Dumbledore's voice stopped him. "Harry." The headmaster's tone was softer now, almost pleading. "Please remember that everything I have done has been out of love and concern for your welfare. Sometimes the greatest kindness requires difficult choices." Harry turned back, and for a moment Dumbledore saw something in the boy's green eyes that made him feel genuinely uneasy for the first time in many years. "Professor," Harry said quietly, I'm beginning to think that the greatest kindness would have been trusting me with the truth from the beginning." After Harry left, Dumbledore sat alone in his office for a very long time. The boy's transformation was more complete than he had feared, and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Someone had been very thorough in their work, providing Harry not only with information, but with the confidence to act on it. The question now was who, and more importantly, how much damage could they do before he found a way to regain control of the situation. Fawkes trilled softly from his perch, a sound that might have been sympathy or warning. Dumbledore was no longer certain which interpretation he preferred. Chapter 8. Strengthening Bonds. The day after Harry's confrontation with Dumbledore found the three of them huddled in a secluded corner of the library, surrounded by books that Daphne had carefully selected from the restricted section and her own family's collection. The tension of the previous day's encounter hung over them like a storm cloud, but there was also an electricity in the air, the sense that they were finally taking action rather than simply observing and planning. "The first thing you need to understand," Daphne said, opening a leather-bound tome titled The Ancient Houses, Rights, Responsibilities and Protocols, is that your family's position in wizarding society goes far beyond wealth or fame. The Potter name carries political weight that has been accumulating for centuries. Harry leaned forward, his attention completely focused, as Daphne traced her finger down a genealogical chart that showed his family's connections to dozens of other magical bloodlines. "This is incredible," he murmured. "I had no idea. Your great-great-grandfather, Charles Potter, was instrumental in establishing the International Confederation of Wizards," Daphne continued. "Your family has held seats on the Wizengamot without interruption since 1692. They've been advocates for magical creature rights, supporters of Muggle protection laws, and mediators in international magical conflicts." Fleur nodded, pulling out a collection of French magical newspapers and journals. "In France, the Potter name is synonymous with honor and progressive thinking. When news of your parents' sacrifice reached our community, there was genuine mourning, not just for the tragedy, but for the loss of allies in the fight for a better magical world." She spread the papers across the table, pointing to headlines and photographs that Harry could barely read, but which clearly featured his family prominently. "These are articles about your father's work with international magical law, your mother's research into protective magic, and the alliances they built throughout Europe. You are not just famous for surviving Voldemort, Harry. You are the heir to a legacy of leadership that spans generations." Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For so long, his fame had felt like a burden, something he hadn't earned and couldn't understand. But this sense of belonging to something larger than himself, of carrying forward work that his parents had believed in, felt different. It felt like purpose. "But how does any of this help me now?" he asked. "I mean, it's fascinating to learn about, but I'm still underage, still stuck under Dumbledore's authority." "Actually, you're not," Daphne said with a small smile. "That's the beauty of magical inheritance law. At 14, as the heir to an ancient house, you have the right to claim your majority in magical matters. It requires certain formal procedures and the backing of other ancient houses, but it's entirely legal." "You could be legally emancipated within a month," Fleur added, "free to make your own decisions about where you live, who you associate with, how you manage your inheritance." Harry stared at them both, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "Are you serious? That's actually possible?" "More than possible," Daphne confirmed. "My father has done some research since I wrote to him yesterday. The Greengrass family would be honored to sponsor your petition for magical majority. Combined with the support of other families, and I believe we can secure that support, Dumbledore would have no legal grounds to oppose it." "But," Fleur said gently, "there would be risks involved. Once you claim your majority, you also claim responsibility for your own safety. The protections that have kept you safe at Privet Drive and Hogwarts would no longer apply." "What protections?" Harry asked bitterly. The ones that ensured I was raised by people who hate me. The ones that kept me ignorant of my own heritage and resources. Harry, Daphne said carefully, I know those arrangements seem cruel and arbitrary, but there may have been genuine magical protections involved. Blood magic is real and powerful. We need to understand exactly what we're dismantling before we dismantle it. Then we find out, Harry said, with a determination that surprised even himself. We go to Gringotts. We demand a full accounting of my inheritance and any magical protections that might exist. We make sure I have all the information I need to make an informed choice. Fleur reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The contact sent warmth shooting up Harry's arm, and he was suddenly very aware of how close they were sitting, how the afternoon light streaming through the library windows caught the silver in her hair. We will help you, she said softly. Whatever you decide, whatever risks you choose to take, you will not face them alone. Harry felt his heart skip, and when he looked up to meet Daphne's eyes, he saw something there that made his pulse quicken even further. There was support, yes, but also something warmer, more personal. Something that spoke of feelings that went beyond political alliances and shared goals. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice rougher than he intended. Both of you. I don't know what I would have done without. You would have figured it out eventually, Daphne interrupted gently. You're far stronger and more capable than anyone has ever given you credit for. We're just speeding up the process a bit. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Daphne explained the intricate web of alliances and obligations that governed pure blood society, teaching Harry to recognize which families might support his bid for independence and which might oppose it. Fleur shared what she knew about international magical law, particularly the treaties that might provide additional protection for someone in Harry's position. The French ministry has already expressed concern about your treatment, she revealed. Not publicly, of course, but there have been quiet inquiries about your welfare and education. If you claimed your majority and sought international recognition of your status, you would likely receive immediate support from several foreign governments. That could be powerful leverage, Daphne added thoughtfully. Dumbledore might have significant influence in Britain, but he cannot simply ignore international pressure, especially if it comes from allies in the fight against Voldemort. As the day wore on, Harry found himself caught between two equally intense feelings. There was the exhilaration of finally understanding his true position in the magical world, the sense that he might actually have options beyond accepting whatever adults decided was best for him. But there was also something else, a growing awareness of the two remarkable young women who had chosen to stake their own reputations and safety on helping him. When Fleur leaned over to point out a particular passage in one of the French journals, her shoulder brushed against his, and Harry caught the faint scent of flowers in her hair. When Daphne's fingers traced the complex family connections on the genealogical charts, he found himself watching the graceful movements of her hands and wondering what it would feel like to hold them. It was confusing and wonderful and terrifying all at once. He had never been the object of anyone's romantic interest before, and certainly not two people as extraordinary as Fleur and Daphne. The possibility that they might see him as something more than a political ally or a friend in need of rescue was almost too much to hope for. "Harry," Daphne said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of concern. "There's something else we need to discuss. Something about the implications of what we're doing here." Harry looked up, noting the serious expression on her face. "What do you mean?" "I mean that this alliance between us, it's not just about your personal independence. If the heir to the Potter family, sponsored by the Greengrass family and supported by international magical communities, claims his majority and begins asserting his political rights." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "It could fundamentally alter the balance of power in Wizarding Britain." Fleur nodded gravely. "You would not just be free to make your own choices, Harry. You would be positioned to influence the choices of others, to shape policy, to build new alliances, to challenge existing power structures. That's a significant responsibility, Daphne continued, one that goes far beyond anything you've had to consider before. Are you prepared for that kind of influence, that kind of scrutiny? Harry was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what they were telling him. Finally, he looked up at both of them, with a resolve that seemed older than his 14 years. I've been used as a symbol my entire life, he said quietly. First as the boy who lived, then as the heir who didn't know he was an heir, now as a pawn in whatever game Dumbledore is playing. If I'm going to be a symbol anyway, I'd rather be one who actually stands for something meaningful. He reached out, placing one hand over Daphne's and the other over Fleur's. Besides, he added with a small smile, I have excellent advisers. The warmth that spread through the small group was palpable, and for the first time since learning the truth about his situation, Harry felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever retaliation Dumbledore might attempt, they would face it together. And if the way Fleur's fingers tightened around his, or the way Daphne's cheeks flushed slightly at his touch were any indication, they might be facing it as something more than mere allies. The future, Harry thought, was beginning to look very interesting indeed. Chapter 9. The Goblin Alliance. The first Hogsmeade weekend of the new term provided the perfect cover for their mission. While most students wandered through the village browsing shops and enjoying butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks, Harry, Fleur, and Daphne made their way to the night bus stop just outside the village boundaries. Harry had never been so nervous about a trip to Gringotts, but then again, he had never before understood just how much might depend on what they learned there. Remember, Daphne murmured, as the purple triple-decker bus screeched to a halt before them. Goblins respect directness and courage above all else. Don't apologize for demanding answers about your own inheritance, and don't let anyone, goblin or wizard, convince you that you're too young to understand your own affairs. Fleur squeezed his arm gently. You are the heir to one of the most respected names in magical Britain. Act like it. The ride to London passed in a blur of nervous anticipation and careful planning. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, researching the exact legal language they would need and the specific questions they had to ask. If Dumbledore truly had been manipulating Harry's inheritance, the evidence would be in the Gringotts records, and goblins, whatever their other faults, were scrupulously honest about financial matters. Gringotts Bank loomed before them in all its marble splendor, but Harry barely noticed the grandeur as they made their way to the reception desk. The goblin seated there looked up with the politely disinterested expression that all Gringotts employees seemed to master. We need to speak with the Potter account manager, Harry said clearly, his voice carrying more authority than he had ever managed before. Immediately, the goblin's eyebrows rose slightly. And you are? Harry Potter, the account holder. The change in the goblin's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. He sat up straighter, his eyes sharpening with what looked like genuine respect. Mr. Potter, I am Griphook. Director Ragnarok will want to see you personally, if you would follow me. As they were led through corridors Harry had never seen before, deeper into the bank's inner workings, he began to understand that his previous visit had shown him only the most superficial layer of Gringotts operations. The corridors here were wider, more ornately decorated, and filled with goblins who stopped their work to watch him pass with expressions of unmistakable interest. Director Ragnarok's office was a testament to goblin craftsmanship. Every surface gleamed with precious metals and intricate carvings, and the massive desk was clearly carved from a single piece of some dark, lustrous stone. The goblin himself was elderly, even by goblin standards, his beard shot through with silver, and his eyes holding the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen centuries of wizarding politics. Mr. Potter, Ragnarok said, rising from his seat with a formal bow that Harry instinctively returned. It is an honor to finally meet you properly. Your performance in the Triwizard Tournament has been most impressive. Facing a dragon with such courage speaks well of your character. "Thank you," Harry replied, settling into one of the comfortable chairs arranged before the desk. Fleur and Daphne took seats on either side of him, and he drew strength from their presence. "Director, I'm here because I've recently learned that I may not have been given complete information about my inheritance and financial situation." Ragnar's expression darkened. "Indeed. We have been concerned about the management of your accounts for some time, Mr. Potter. The restrictions placed upon your access have been highly irregular." "What sort of restrictions?" Daphne asked, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to dealing with financial institutions. "Perhaps it would be best if I showed you the complete records," Ragnar said grimly. With a wave of his hand, several thick ledgers appeared on the desk before them. "Mr. Potter, you are the heir to not one, but 7 separate vaults, including the main Potter family vault, your parents' personal accounts, and inherited holdings from your grandparents on both sides." Harry felt the blood drain from his face. 7 vaults? But I've only ever seen one. The smallest one, yes. Your school vault, which contains perhaps 2% of your total holdings. Ragnar opened the first ledger, revealing columns of figures that made Harry's eyes water. "The Potter family fortune is among the 10 largest in magical Britain. You own properties in 12 countries, have substantial interests in magical businesses throughout Europe, and hold investment portfolios that generate more income in a year than most wizards see in a lifetime." Fleur leaned forward, her expression troubled. "And Harry was never told about any of this?" "On the contrary," Ragnar said, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled anger. "We have sent detailed financial statements to Mr. Potter's registered address every month for the past 13 years. We have also sent correspondence regarding investment opportunities, property management decisions, and formal invitations to claim his majority and take control of his accounts." "I never received any of those letters," Harry said quietly. "Not a single one. Which brings us to the most troubling aspect of this situation." Ragnar opened another ledger, this one filled with official correspondence. "All of your mail has been redirected to a secondary address by order of one Albus Dumbledore, who claimed legal guardianship over your financial affairs." Harry's hands clenched into fists. "On what authority?" "That," Ragnar said with grim satisfaction, "is where the matter becomes most interesting. We have investigated thoroughly, Mr. Potter, and can find no legal document granting Mr. Dumbledore any authority over your inheritance. His guardianship appears to be entirely self-appointed." The silence that followed was deafening. Harry felt something cold and furious settling in his chest as the full scope of Dumbledore's deception became clear. "Furthermore," Ragnar continued, "Mr. Dumbledore has been making withdrawals from your accounts without authorization. Substantial withdrawals, totaling nearly 50,000 galleons over the past 4 years. "For what purpose?" Daphne demanded, her voice sharp with outrage. The stated purpose was security arrangements and guardianship expenses. However, we have no record of any legitimate services being provided in exchange for these funds." Harry closed his eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Not only had Dumbledore kept him ignorant of his inheritance, he had been stealing from it. "What can be done?" he asked finally, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Ragnar's smile was sharp and predatory. "A great deal, Mr. Potter. As the rightful heir, you have the authority to immediately revoke all unauthorized access to your accounts. You can also petition for legal emancipation, which, given the circumstances and your performance in the tournament, we would be honored to support." "The tournament?" Fleur asked. "Goblin society values courage and honor above all else," Ragnar explained. "Mr. Potter's willingness to face a dragon, his conduct during the competition, and his treatment of all competitors with respect and fairness have earned him significant respect among our people. When word spreads that he is asserting his rightful independence, he will find many allies among the Goblin nation." Over the next 2 hours, they worked through the complex legal documents necessary to establish Harry's independence. Director Ragnok proved to be both knowledgeable and surprisingly sympathetic, explaining not just the legal requirements, but the broader implications of each decision. "This document," he said, sliding a formal parchment across the desk, "establishes your magical majority and removes all external authority over your financial affairs. This one creates a formal alliance between the Potter family and Gringotts, ensuring that any future attempts to interfere with your inheritance will be met with the full force of goblin law." "And this?" Harry asked, pointing to a particularly ornate document covered in both English and what he assumed was gobbledygook. "This," Ragnok said with evident pleasure, "formally recognizes Miss Delacour and Miss Greengrass as your trusted advisors and allies, granting them certain diplomatic protections under international magical law. Should anyone attempt to retaliate against them for their support of your independence, they would be challenging not just you, but the Goblin Nation itself." Harry looked at his two companions, seeing the surprise and gratitude in their faces. "You're certain this is legal?" "Completely. The Potter family has maintained alliance agreements with Gringotts for over 3 centuries. You are simply exercising rights that have always existed." As Harry signed the final documents, he felt something fundamental shifting inside him. For the first time in his life, he was making decisions about his own future based on complete information and his own judgment. The sensation was both terrifying and exhilarating. "There is one more matter," Ragnok said, as they prepared to leave. "The properties and businesses you now control include several that were specifically established by your parents for protective purposes. There are safe houses in 7 countries, each protected by powerful wards and stocked with everything you might need. There are also other resources that your parents believed you might one day require." "What sort of resources?" Daphne asked. "Intelligence networks, allies in foreign governments, magical artifacts of considerable power." Ragnok's expression was grave. "Your parents were not merely fighting a war, Mr. Potter. They were preparing for the possibility that the war might continue beyond their lifetimes." Harry felt a chill run down his spine. "They knew I might need these things." "They hoped you would never need them," Ragnok corrected gently. "But they were wise enough to prepare for the worst. These resources are now at your disposal, should circumstances require their use." As they left Gringotts, Harry carried with him not just legal documents establishing his independence, but a new understanding of who he truly was and what he was capable of becoming. The boy who had entered the bank that morning had been wealthy but powerless. The young man who emerged was one of the most influential figures in magical Britain, with allies, resources, and options that even Albus Dumbledore could not simply dismiss. "How do you feel?" Fleur asked softly as they made their way back toward the night bus. Harry considered the question carefully. "Free," he said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free." Daphne smiled, linking her arm through his. "Then we've accomplished what we set out to do." "No," Harry said, his voice carrying a new note of determination. "We've accomplished the first step. Now comes the real work." As the night bus carried them back toward Hogsmeade, Harry found himself thinking not about what he had escaped, but about what he could build. For the first time, the future felt like something he could shape, rather than something that would simply happen to him. And with Fleur and Daphne beside him, that future looked very bright indeed. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The summons came during breakfast on a Tuesday morning, delivered by Professor McGonagall with an expression that suggested she found the entire matter distasteful. Harry had been sitting with Fleur and Daphne at the Ravenclaw table, a seating arrangement that had become common since their return from Gringotts, when McGonagall appeared at his shoulder. "Mr. Potter, the headmaster requires your presence in his office immediately," she said, her voice carrying a formality that was unusual even for her. "He has also asked me to inform Miss Delacour and Miss Greengrass that effective immediately, students from different schools are required to take their meals at their designated house tables." The Great Hall, which had been buzzing with the usual breakfast conversation, fell noticeably quieter as nearby students strained to listen. Harry felt Fleur's hand tighten on his arm and saw Daphne's jaw clench with barely controlled anger. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Harry said clearly, his voice carrying far enough that half the hall could hear him. "Miss Delacour and Miss Greengrass are my formally appointed advisors under international magical law. Any attempt to separate us could be interpreted as interference with legally protected relationships." McGonagall's eyebrows rose sharply. "Mr. Potter, I'm not certain what you mean by—" "I mean," Harry interrupted, rising from his seat with a dignity that seemed to surprise even himself, "that as of last week, I am a legally emancipated adult with full rights under wizarding law. The headmaster's authority over my personal associations ended the moment I claimed my magical majority. The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in the great hall stopped, every head turned toward their table, and Harry could feel the weight of hundreds of stares. From the staff table, he could see Dumbledore rising from his chair, his face carefully composed, but his eyes sharp with something that might have been alarm. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "I think there may be some confusion about your legal status. Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Harry replied, his voice steady and clear. "I think we should discuss this right here, where everyone can witness what's being said." Dumbledore descended from the staff table with measured steps, his robes billowing behind him in a way that usually made him seem imposing and wise. Today, to Harry's eyes, it simply looked theatrical. "My dear boy," Dumbledore said gently, coming to stand before their table, "I understand that you may have received some advice that has led you to believe certain things about your legal situation. However, as your magical guardian, I must insist that any such arrangements be reviewed and approved through proper channels." "You are not my magical guardian," Harry said flatly. "You never were. The goblins at Gringotts were very clear about that. You have no legal authority over my inheritance, my finances, or my personal affairs. You never did." A murmur rippled through the assembled students. Harry could see shock and confusion on many faces, but also something else, a growing sense of anticipation, as if they were witnessing something momentous. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining things to particularly slow students, "there are protections in place that require certain oversight of your affairs, the blood magic that has kept you safe all these years." "You mean the protections that required me to live with relatives who despised me?" Harry interrupted. "The ones that ensured I knew nothing about my own heritage or resources? Those protections?" "Sometimes," Dumbledore said, his eyes beginning to lose their twinkle. "Difficult choices must be made for the greater good. Your safety has always been my primary concern." Harry felt a familiar wave of guilt and shame attempting to wash over him, the same feeling he always got when Dumbledore spoke about sacrifices made for his benefit. But this time, instead of accepting that weight, he examined it and found it wanting. "My safety," he said slowly, "or my compliance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harry could see Dumbledore's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his grandfatherly facade. "I'm not certain what you're implying, Harry." "I'm not implying anything," Harry replied. "I'm stating facts. For 13 years you intercepted my mail from Gringotts, keeping me ignorant of my own inheritance. You made unauthorized withdrawals from my accounts, totaling nearly 50,000 galleons. You ensured that I had no contact with families who wanted to offer friendship and support. You kept me isolated, ignorant, and dependent." The murmur from the assembled students grew louder. Harry could see shocked faces throughout the hall, and not all of them were sympathetic to Dumbledore. At the Slytherin table, several older students were nodding with grim satisfaction, while at Hufflepuff, Susan Bones was staring at Dumbledore with something approaching horror. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine warning. You are still very young, and there are forces in this world that you do not yet understand. The path I have set for you is not the path I choose, Harry interrupted firmly. I reject any predetermined destiny you think you've arranged for me. I reject the idea that my ignorance was necessary for my protection, and I reject your authority to make decisions about my life without my knowledge or consent. The silence was deafening. Harry could see professors at the staff table shifting uncomfortably, students throughout the hall hanging on every word. This wasn't just a disagreement between a student and a headmaster. This was a fundamental challenge to the order of things at Hogwarts. You speak of choice, Dumbledore said, his voice growing harder. But you are still a child, Harry. A child who has been influenced by people who may not have your best interests at heart. On the contrary, Harry replied, gesturing toward Fleur and Daphne, who had risen to stand beside him. I've been influenced by people who believe I have the right to know the truth about my own life. People who think I'm capable of making informed decisions about my future. People who see me as something more than a pawn to be moved around a chessboard. And what of the prophecy? Dumbledore asked, his voice dropping to a level that was nevertheless clearly audible throughout the hall. What of your destiny to face Voldemort? Do you think you can simply walk away from that responsibility? Harry felt a chill run down his spine, but not from fear, from anger. You're talking about a prophecy that was made about me, but never shared with me. A destiny that was imposed on me without my knowledge or agreement. If I have a responsibility to face Voldemort, it's because I choose to take it on. Not because you've decided it's my fate. Some burdens, Dumbledore said heavily, cannot be chosen. They simply are. Perhaps, Harry agreed. But the way I bear those burdens, that is my choice, and I choose to bear them with full knowledge of my situation, with allies I trust, and with resources I control. Not in ignorance, not in isolation, and not under the control of someone who has already proven willing to lie to me for what he considers my own good. Around the Great Hall, Harry could see students beginning to take sides. Many of the younger students looked confused and frightened, but the older ones, particularly those from families involved in wizarding politics, were watching with expressions of growing understanding and approval. At the Ravenclaw table, several seventh years were nodding in agreement. Even some Gryffindors seemed to be reconsidering their automatic loyalty to Dumbledore. Harry, Dumbledore said, his voice carrying a note of genuine pleading now. I have made mistakes. Perhaps I have been too protective, too cautious about sharing certain information with you. But everything I have done has been motivated by love and concern for your welfare. I believe that, Harry said quietly, and for a moment, something like the old warmth flickered between them. But good intentions don't justify deception. Love doesn't justify control, and concern for my welfare doesn't justify keeping me ignorant of my own life. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Harry's face as if seeing him clearly for the first time. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Harry had never heard before. What do you want, Harry? I want honesty, Harry replied immediately. I want transparency. I want to be consulted before decisions are made about my life. And I want the freedom to choose my own path, even if it's not the path you would have chosen for me. And if that path leads to disaster? If your inexperience results in consequences you cannot foresee? Harry smiled slightly, and there was something in that expression that reminded everyone watching that this was someone who had faced down a Hungarian horntail and lived to tell about it. Then I'll face those consequences, he said simply, because they'll be the result of my choices, not someone else's manipulation. Dumbledore nodded slowly, and Harry could see the moment when the headmaster accepted that the game had fundamentally changed. Very well, he said quietly. But understand, Harry, that there will be challenges ahead that require more than courage and good intentions. There will be times when you need guidance, when experience matters more than independence. When those times come, Harry replied, I'll seek guidance from people I trust, people who have proven they believe in my right to make my own choices. As Dumbledore turned to leave the Great Hall, Harry could see the weight of defeat in his shoulders. But he could also see something else, a grudging respect, perhaps even a recognition that Harry's transformation, however inconvenient, was also necessary. The Great Hall remained silent until the headmaster disappeared through the doors. Then the noise erupted all at once, excited conversations, heated arguments, speculation about what would happen next. But through it all, Harry remained standing beside Fleur and Daphne, feeling for the first time in his life like he was exactly where he belonged. That was magnificent, Fleur whispered, her eyes shining with admiration. That was terrifying, Daphne added, but she was smiling as she said it. Harry looked around the Great Hall, seeing the faces of his fellow students, the mixture of support and uncertainty and excitement in their eyes. He had challenged one of the most powerful wizards in the world, in public, and he had won, not through force or magic, but through the simple assertion of his right to control his own life. It wasn't a complete victory. There would be consequences, complications, further challenges to navigate. But for the first time since learning the truth about his situation, Harry felt like he was moving forward rather than simply reacting to what others had planned for him. The future was uncertain, but it was his uncertainty now, and that made all the difference. Chapter 11. New Alliances. In the 3 days following Harry's public confrontation with Dumbledore, Hogwarts felt like a different school entirely. The rigid house boundaries that had governed social interactions for centuries seemed to dissolve almost overnight, replaced by something far more complex and fluid. Students found themselves choosing sides not based on the colors of their robes, but on their principles and their assessment of what they had witnessed in the Great Hall. Harry discovered this new reality when he arrived at breakfast the morning after the confrontation to find Susan Bones, a Hufflepuff fourth year, waiting by the Ravenclaw table where he had been sitting with Fleur and Daphne. Harry, she said quietly, her voice carrying a nervousness that suggested this wasn't easy for her. My aunt would like to speak with you. Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She said she's been trying to contact you for years. Harry felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Your aunt wrote to me. Every year since you started at Hogwarts. Birthday cards, invitations to family gatherings, offers to tell you about your parents. They work together, you know. She was devastated when those letters never reached you. Susan's expression hardened. She wants to make sure you know that the Bones family supports your decision to claim your independence. Completely. As Susan returned to her own table, Harry noticed something he hadn't seen before. Other students were watching, but not with the usual mixture of curiosity and fear that his fame typically generated. These looks were different, assessing, respectful, even hopeful. It's starting, Daphne murmured, following his gaze around the Great Hall. Students are realizing that if you can challenge Dumbledore's authority and win, maybe they don't have to accept everything they've been told about how things work either. She was right. Over the next few days, a steady stream of students approached their table during meals, offering quiet words of support or asking careful questions about what had really happened with Harry's inheritance. Most surprising of all, many of these students were from Slytherin, older students from prominent families who seemed to view Harry's assertion of independence with something approaching professional admiration. It's not personal loyalty, Daphne explained when Harry commented on this unexpected support. It's respect for competence. You identified a threat to your interests, gathered intelligence, built alliances, and neutralized that threat through legal and political means. That's exactly how pure-blood politics is supposed to work. The international implications became clear when Victor Crumb approached their table during dinner on Thursday evening. The Bulgarian champion's usual stoic expression carried a note of something that might have been approval. "Potter," he said in his heavily accented English, "I wish to speak with you about what happened in Great Hall." Harry tensed slightly, uncertain what to expect, but Crumb's next words surprised him. "In Bulgaria, we have saying, 'A man who cannot control his own life cannot be trusted to control anything else.' You have shown that you can control your own life, even against very powerful opposition. This makes you someone worth knowing." As Crumb returned to the Durmstrang table, Harry caught sight of several of the Bulgarian students nodding in his direction with what looked like respect. "It's not just Durmstrang," Fleur said softly. "I received an owl from Madame Maxime this morning. She has been in contact with the French ministry about your situation. They are very interested in establishing formal diplomatic relations with the heir to the Potter family." Harry blinked in surprise. "Diplomatic relations? With me, personally?" "With you as a representative of one of Britain's most influential magical families," Fleur clarified. "Harry, what you did wasn't just about personal independence. You demonstrated that the old power structures in British wizarding society can be challenged successfully. That has implications far beyond Hogwarts." The full scope of those implications became clear the following morning, when Harry received 3 owls simultaneously during breakfast. The first carried the seal of the French Ministry of Magic, the second bore the insignia of the International Confederation of Wizards, and the third was marked with the ancient crest of the Greengrass family. "Congratulations," Daphne said dryly, as Harry stared at the trio of official-looking letters. "I think you've just become a political figure, whether you wanted to or not." The French ministry letter was formal, but warm, expressing official interest in renewing the traditional friendship between the Potter family and the French magical community. It included an invitation to visit the French ministry at Harry's earliest convenience, along with formal recognition of his legal emancipation under international magical law. The International Confederation letter was more circumspect, but carried the signatures of representatives from 7 different magical governments, all expressing interest in establishing formal diplomatic contacts with the reconstituted House of Potter. But it was the Greengrass family letter that affected Harry most deeply. Written in Lord Greengrass's precise handwriting, it offered not just political support, but something more personal. The Greengrass family has always valued honor, courage, and the right of individuals to choose their own paths. Your recent actions demonstrate all of these qualities in abundance. We would be honored to offer not only our political support, but our personal friendship and protection. In the old traditions, we offer you the hospitality of our house and the loyalty of our family. Daphne has chosen her allies well, and we are proud to call you friend. Harry read the letter twice before looking up to find Daphne watching him with an expression that was part nervousness and part hope. Your family is offering to essentially adopt me, he said quietly. Not adopt, Daphne corrected. Accept. As an equal, as a friend, as someone worthy of trust and respect. It's not an offer we make lightly. Harry felt something warm and overwhelming settle in his chest. For so long, he had felt isolated, cut off from the networks of family and friendship that seemed to sustain everyone else. Now, suddenly, he was being offered membership in something larger than himself, not as a symbol or a weapon, but as a person. I would be honored to accept, he said, and watched Daphne's smile transform her entire face. As word of these various alliances and offers spread through the school, Harry began to notice subtle changes in how other students interacted with him. The younger students still stared, but now it was with a mixture of awe and aspiration rather than simple curiosity. The older students, particularly those from prominent families, began approaching him with questions about everything from magical law to international relations. You're becoming what you never wanted to be, Fleur observed one evening as they studied in the library, surrounded by students who had quietly positioned themselves within earshot of their conversation. A leader. "I never asked to be a leader," Harry replied, but he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "The best leaders rarely do," Daphne said gently. "They become leaders because circumstances require it, and they're the ones willing to step forward when others won't." Harry looked around the library, seeing the faces of students who seemed to be looking to him for something: guidance, inspiration, perhaps just the reassurance that change was possible. It was overwhelming and terrifying and oddly exhilarating all at once. "What am I supposed to do with all this?" he asked quietly. "Whatever you think is right," Fleur replied immediately. "That's the point of independence, isn't it? The freedom to choose your own path, even when that path leads to responsibilities you didn't expect." That evening, as Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room working on a potions essay, he was approached by Neville Longbottom. The normally timid boy seemed unusually determined as he settled into the chair across from Harry's. "Harry," Neville said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? For what?" "For showing everyone that it's possible to stand up to people who claim to know what's best for you." Neville's voice was stronger than Harry had ever heard it. "My grandmother has been making decisions about my life without asking me what I want. After seeing what you did with Dumbledore, well, I'm going to start making my own choices." As Neville walked away, Harry realized that his confrontation with Dumbledore had created ripples far beyond what he had intended. Students throughout the school were beginning to question authority they had never thought to challenge, to assert independence they hadn't known they possessed. Later that evening, as Harry walked the corridors back from the library, he found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he had been an ignorant, isolated boy, dependent on adults who claimed to know better. Now he was apparently a political figure with international allies and students looking to him for leadership. It was Fleur who found him standing in one of the castle's alcoves, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. "Having second thoughts?" she asked gently, moving to stand beside him. "Not second thoughts exactly," Harry said slowly. "More like trying to understand what I've become." "What you've always been," Fleur corrected. "The difference is that now you know it." She moved closer, and Harry became acutely aware of her warmth, the faint scent of flowers in her hair, the way the moonlight streaming through the window made her silver-blue dress robes shimmer. "Fleur," he said quietly, "about what's happening between us, between all of us." "Yes?" she prompted, her voice soft. "I don't want you to think that I'm taking advantage of the situation, or that I don't understand how complicated this all is." Fleur smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek gently. "Harry Potter," she said, her accent making his name sound like music. "You are perhaps the most honorable person I have ever met. Whatever happens between us, between all of us, it will be because we choose it freely, with full knowledge of what it means." As she leaned up to kiss his cheek softly before walking away, Harry realized that his new independence hadn't just given him control over his finances and his future. It had given him something far more precious: the right to choose who he loved, and the confidence to believe that he might be worthy of being loved in return. The future stretched out before him, full of possibilities he was only beginning to understand. And for the first time in his life, that future felt entirely his own. Chapter 12. The future unfolds. The morning of the second task dawned crisp and clear, with February sunlight glinting off the surface of the Great Lake. Harry stood on the shore with the other champions, but everything about his demeanor had changed since the first task. Where once he had been nervous and isolated, frantically trying to figure out the task alone, now he stood with quiet confidence, flanked by allies who had spent weeks helping him prepare. "Remember," Daphne murmured quietly, "you're not just representing yourself today. You're demonstrating what the heir to the Potter family is capable of when he has access to his full resources and proper support. Fleur nodded, her hand resting briefly on his arm. Show them what you truly are, Harry. Show them what they tried to keep hidden. The transformation was visible to everyone watching, where the other champions fidgeted nervously or stared at the dark water with obvious apprehension. Harry reviewed his strategy with the calm focus of someone who had been properly prepared for what lay ahead. The gillyweed he carried had been acquired through legitimate channels, with Daphne's family connections ensuring he had access to the highest quality. The backup plans they had developed covered every possible contingency. Most importantly, he no longer felt alone. When the starting whistle blew, Harry dove into the lake with the fluid grace of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The gillyweed took effect immediately, and as he swam through the murky depths toward the merpeople's village, he found himself thinking not about survival, but about excellence. He was no longer the confused, unprepared boy who had stumbled through the first task. He was Harry Potter, heir to an ancient house, with allies in 3 countries and resources most wizards could only dream of. He had every intention of demonstrating exactly what that meant. The task itself went flawlessly. Harry retrieved Ron from the merpeople's custody with time to spare, but instead of simply completing his own objective and leaving, he remained to ensure that all the other champions successfully completed theirs as well. It was a gesture of leadership and magnanimity that was noted by everyone watching. When he emerged from the lake, Ron in tow and breathing normally despite their extended underwater journey, the crowd's reaction was markedly different from what he had received after the first task. This wasn't just relief that he had survived or amazement at his luck. This was recognition of competence, of someone who had approached a serious challenge with proper preparation and executed his plan perfectly. "Magnificent," Judge Crouch announced as the scores were tallied. "A flawless performance that demonstrates not only magical skill, but also strategic thinking and leadership." Harry's score was the highest of any champion in either task, but more importantly, the way he had achieved it sent a clear message to everyone watching. This was not the same Harry Potter who had entered the tournament as an unwilling participant. This was someone who had transformed himself into exactly the kind of wizard his heritage suggested he should be. As the crowds began to disperse, Harry found himself surrounded not just by Fleur and Daphne, but by a growing circle of supporters. Students from all houses, international visitors, even some of the judges approached to offer congratulations that went far beyond his performance in the task. "Mr. Potter," Madame Maxime said formally, "Beauxbatons Academy would be honored to establish a formal relationship with the House of Potter. Your demonstration of excellence today, combined with your recent political maturation, suggests opportunities for mutual benefit." Similar offers came from representatives of the other visiting schools, from older students whose families had political connections, and from professors who seemed to view Harry with new respect. But it was Dumbledore's approach that drew the most attention. The headmaster walked slowly across the grounds, his usually twinkling eyes serious and thoughtful. When he reached Harry, he paused for a long moment, studying the young man who had once been his carefully controlled protégé. "Congratulations, Harry," he said quietly. "Your performance today was exemplary in every respect." "Thank you, Professor," Harry replied, and there was neither hostility nor subservience in his voice, simply the acknowledgement of one adult by another. "I find myself thinking," Dumbledore continued, his voice carrying to the nearby observers, "that perhaps I have been too focused on protection and not enough on preparation. You have shown today what you are capable of when properly supported and trusted to make your own decisions." It was as close to a public apology as anyone was likely to get from Albus Dumbledore, and Harry recognized it for what it was. "I appreciate that, sir," he said. "I hope we can work together in the future, as allies who respect each other's choices, rather than as guardian and ward." Dumbledore nodded slowly. "I believe that would be wise." As the headmaster walked away, Harry felt a chapter of his life closing, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had stood up for himself and earned respect in return. The celebration that evening was unlike anything Harry had ever experienced. Instead of the usual house divisions, students mingled freely throughout the great hall, united in recognition of what they had witnessed. Harry found himself at the center of it all, but this time by choice rather than circumstance. "You know," Ron said, approaching with a mixture of awkwardness and genuine admiration, "I'm starting to understand why you've been spending so much time with Slytherins and foreign students. They actually treat you like you know what you're doing." Harry smiled, clapping his friend on the shoulder. "There's room for everyone, Ron. This doesn't have to change our friendship." "Maybe not," Ron agreed, "but it definitely changes what our friendship looks like." As the evening wore on, Harry found himself on the astronomy tower with Fleur and Daphne, looking out over the grounds where everything had changed so dramatically over the past months. "So," Daphne said, settling beside him on one of the stone benches, "what comes next?" It was a question that would have terrified Harry a few months ago. Now, with allies he trusted and resources he understood, the future felt like an opportunity rather than a burden. "The tournament still has one task left," he said thoughtfully. "After that, well, I suppose I start learning what it really means to be the head of an ancient house." "It means responsibility," Fleur said, taking his other side, "but also opportunity. The chance to make decisions that affect not just your own life, but the lives of others who depend on your leadership." "No pressure," Harry said dryly, and all three of them laughed. "We'll figure it out together," Daphne assured him. "That's what partnerships are for." Harry looked at both of them, these remarkable young women who had risked their own reputations and safety to help him discover who he really was. Whatever the future held, he knew it would be infinitely better for having them beside him. "Together," he agreed. "I like the sound of that." Below them, Hogwarts spread out in all its ancient majesty. But for the first time since arriving at the castle, Harry felt like he truly belonged there, not as a famous orphan or a convenient symbol, but as himself. The future stretched out before them, full of challenges and opportunities he was only beginning to understand. But whatever came next, he would face it with allies who believed in him, resources he controlled, and choices that were entirely his own. For someone who had spent most of his life being told what to do by others, that felt like the most powerful magic of all. "You know," he said softly, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, "I think this is just the beginning." Fleur and Daphne moved closer, one on each side, and Harry felt the warmth of belonging settle around him like a protective charm. The boy who had been manipulated and controlled was gone forever. In his place sat someone who was ready to write his own story, surrounded by people who would help him make it extraordinary. The future had never looked brighter. As they sat together, planning their next steps, summer visits to France, meetings with political allies, the establishment of Harry's adult household, one thing was perfectly clear. Harry Potter was no longer someone things happened to. He was someone who made things happen. And with Fleur and Daphne beside him, ready to share whatever adventures lay ahead, that future felt limitless in its possibilities.